to Flick's video 6.2 about European colonization. This is actually going to be a two-part video. The first one we're going to be discussing Portugal and Spain, and then the second video we're going to be talking about British and Dutch colonization. So the essential question at the top are, what were the defining characteristics of European colonization of the Americas? And this is going to take us through two flipped videos. Generally speaking, one of the first most significant consequences of European colonization and Spanish and Portuguese colonization specifically was the globalization of Christianity. Specifically, Catholicism, as you can see depicted here in the Spanish colonies in red and the Portuguese in green and the French in blue. Catholicism really spread throughout Latin America, specifically from the work of the missionaries, and we talked about that as one of the major motivations for exploration on the whole. So you can see in this map just how Christianity starts to become, or the groundwork is laid for Christianity to become the largest religion of the world, which it is here in 2016. One important characteristic that I also want to note just in general, because I never want to forget to have a gender-inclusive conversation, is about the role of women in these colonies. Women in both the Spanish and Portuguese colonies were subject to the conquest and the violence that men faced as well, but they were also used as instruments of diplomacy, meaning that there were also negotiations, deals that would be sealed with this saying that this such and such conquistador would be promised women, for example, as in a form of alliance. So we truly see that women are being subservient, which is a change from the way they were treated in the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca empires, which we'll return to momentarily. Now we're going to talk about first about the Spanish Empire. So each one of these slides is going to be titled the Spanish Empire or New Spain. So I'm going to separate this first into the former Aztec lands and Inca lands versus what I'm going to call the sugar colonies of Spain and Portugal. So this is important. We're going to first discuss the former Aztec and Inca lands. No need to recopy this, but you remember that Hernan Cortez established control of this land for the Spanish in 1521, and Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca to expand the Spanish territory in 1533, and as you recall, that had a devastating effect on the Native American population as a result of the transmission of diseases such as smallpox and measles, mumps, whooping coughs, influenza, so on and so forth. So in the entire Spanish Empire, so both the former Aztec and Inca lands, plus what I'm going to call the sugar colonies, Spain began to establish political control of this region by dividing up this region into what are called viceroyalties, and the viceroy. So if you drop the ALTs off of that word, the viceroy was the lead or the head representation of the Spanish government in these regions. So these are just bureaucratic systems. Remember that hierarchy, all organized under centralized control. And these viceroys answered to the Spanish or Portuguese king, in this instance here, Spain. And you can see that this is laying the groundwork for this division of power and the growth of what is known as an empire in this time. The economy of these regions, of the lands that were formerly controlled by the Aztec and the Inca, this economy is based upon plantation agriculture and silver and gold mining. So plantation agriculture is defined by the idea that this is a large-scale plot of land. It's going to be grown. What's grown on that plantation is grown for cash cropping. So it's grown specifically for profit and to be exported to another country. It's not being grown specifically for the local people to eat. So we're talking about just growing a single crop here. And of course, the conquistadors and the Spanish were very interested in extracting silver and gold. Silver was even considered to be the heart of this empire. You can see the massive amount of wealth that was being exported to Spain, being extracted from the colonies here. Now, naturally, this plantation agriculture and the mining system is going to lead to the development of forced labor systems. And these forced labor systems were put into place as a result of the Spanish trying to implement that mercantilism idea, the idea that the colonies exist for the sole purpose of benefiting the mother country, to extract what's called bullion, silver and gold from the colonies, bring that back, and create that favorable balance of trade for the mother country. So there's several different iterations, several different versions of forced labor systems or coerced labor systems that the Spanish used in the former Aztec and Inca lands. The first is known as encomienda, right? So encomienda was the first initial system. It actually started in the era of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand and Christopher Columbus. This is a legal system where the Spanish crown, quote-unquote, granted the Spanish settlers in the colonies people to work on this land. So the local people owed the Spanish owed, there we go, the Spanish labor, gold, or agricultural produce. First of all, these native peoples don't owe them anything, but that's the concept here. And in return, the Spanish, quote unquote, owed the local people protection and to Christianize them. So it's this. I actually like this graphic here about the plan versus the reality. The plan is the Spanish protect and care for and Christianize, which of course is a very condescending way to view the native peoples to begin with. These are former successful, thriving, advanced civilizations. And in return, the Indians would work a portion of their time for the settlers, and they would owe them this gold or their production. The reality is this essentially is just another name for the way to enslave the local people. This was an unsuccessful system for the most part, and ultimately became replaced with something that's not particularly different. It was called repartiamento, which was a forced labor system where the native peoples or the indigenous peoples were forced to do unpaid work for several weeks a year for the Spanish Empire. And this may sound familiar to you because this was modeled after the Inca Mita system. So they've taken over these people and they're now utilizing their own concept of labor to benefit themselves. So this is really, this is why colonization really is another name for this conquest here and this progressive enslavement of the groups of people. Now, don't forget that throughout this entire period, the native peoples are also facing tremendous diseases and dying off from these diseases. So this is also going to impede or prevent the success of some of these forced labor systems and ultimately lead to the enslavement of Africans. The final system that was the beginning of what's called contractual labor was called the hacienda system. And so the haciendas were these large plantations, and these large estates would directly employ native workers. They were called peons. But this was really characterized by low wages, high taxes, and extremely large debt to landowners. So even though this is paid labor in name, this is really just another way to subjugate and to dominate the local people. So 3 different iterations how in the former Aztec and Inca lands the Spanish gained control. Now what this led to is this very distinctive social order or social class system that was based upon ethnicity. So each one of those terms, I want you to have this chart down, but I want to make sure you know the definitions of each one of these terms as well. At the very top of this social pyramid would be the people called the peninsulars, and these were the people who were born in the old world. So these were people who were born in Spain or in Portugal, and these were the administrators. These were the highest class, and they were seen as essentially pure blood. Secondly, below them would be Creoles, and these are people who are born the children of peninsulars. So they are the white settlers whose children were born in this quote-unquote new world, in the colonies. And they eventually begin, as it says here, to dominate in the politics and the economy. They take increasingly important roles. It's all based upon this idea of a bloodline. Below them is this mixed class between the mestizos and mulattoes. So mestizos are people who are European mixed with American Indian, so the Native Americans. Mulattoes were people who were the mix between European and African. Both of these if there's a way for me to depict the significant difference in power and social power here, I would, because the difference between the peninsulars and the Creoles was significantly different than the power of the mestizos and mulattoes. So we're starting to see that social conflict emerging here. And below that are the people who are the lowest rung of society, who are being subjugated and dominated, which would be the Native Americans, also known as Amerindians, and the enslaved Africans, who started to become imported as the forced labor systems drove out the Native Americans, as the forced labor systems began to fail as more and more Native Americans were subject to diseases. Now, this social ordering, this really interesting social class system here that's based upon this ethnicity, can largely be explained, specifically the mestizo and mulatto population, because of the lack of women in the Spanish colonies. So this incredible significance that's being placed on your bloodline for peninsulars and Creoles is a product without a significant portion of women. So, for example, there were 7 men to every single woman in Peru of Spanish women. Then that leads to a greater mixed population. And this is going to come back and be of significance when we start to talk about some of these independence movements. And we're going to see, what are people really fighting for? Is it social equality, or is it just to get rid of the colonial system? So the social class system was going to come back to us. Just touching base again on the role of women, that the Spanish women here were valued because of this belief in social superiority based upon their race, but they're still treated subservient to men. They would not be able to own property, even the Spanish women, which again is a shift because in the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca had these systems of gender complementary roles, and so that really violates that. For example, there was a brief story there about a Maya and Maya men and women who brought a lawsuit against the Spanish, and the Spanish heard it in court, but they crossed out the names of the Maya women because they viewed it as not able to be maintaining a claim in court. So just a clear difference in gender expectations here. Okay, now let's switch gears. Let's look at the colonies of sugar. That's what I'm going to call them. Where are these colonies located? They're the lowlands of Brazil. So Brazil was colonized by Portugal, and the Caribbean colonies that were controlled by the Spanish, the British, the French, and the Dutch. So we're talking about some areas of Brazil and then the Caribbean in the Central American region. The key difference here is that these colonies were not built upon existing empires. So they're not taking over these systems of the Aztec and Inca. They are essentially establishing control over these regions and building systems to their benefit because they're not taking over places that have strong political and economic organization that are already there. Similarly, there was no minerals until here, so there wasn't the gold and silver that they were searching for. They didn't discover the presence of gold until the 1690s, and diamonds were discovered much later. But that really wasn't the cash crop. That wasn't the source of the income here. And that, in turn, the reason why these colonies were in fact colonized and why they in line with that mercantilism idea, is that they found that sugar could grow here tremendously well. And that sugar, that Europeans had an incredible sweet tooth that they had acquired, and that they learned that that sugar could be produced extremely well in these climates and exported back to Europe. The cultivation of this sugar, by the way, was actually learned from the Arabs, which you learned when you read about the sugar trade here, that the Muslims learned this large-scale plantation cultivation of sugar, which would be used for not just sugar to eat, but also into liquor and into rum, which is what we discussed. This sugar production was incredibly labor intensive, incredibly. To chop down, my picture's cut off here a little bit, but to chop down sugarcane is basically a bamboo stick. It's so hard and is so challenging to chop down. So this is back-breaking labor, and but at the same time, sugar production was also most profitable when it was done at a very large scale. So large scale plantations, and which meant that they would then in turn need tons and tons of labor. And that tons and tons of labor was initially tried, as we saw with the native populations, but in practice, what became the source of most of this labor was the massive enslavement of Africans to meet that labor demand. Most of the Native Americans in Brazil, they'd actually fled inland, and we'll talk about that. They started these communities called quilombos, or these Native Americans had died. So Africans become the source of the labor, specifically in these Caribbean and the sugar production regions. The conditions of enslavement in Central and South America were horrendous, and I will not entertain the idea of comparing and contrasting any conditions of enslavement in the sense that this is all enslavement, but it's important to understand that the production of sugar was not only backbreaking labor in a very hot climate, but the process of actually heating the sugar to break this down into mineral sugar was so very dangerous, and these conditions were incredibly inhospitable. So this leads to an extremely high death toll among the enslaved population. In turn, that means that there's many more enslaved Africans that are being consistently brought in. So as more and more enslaved Africans come, that actually leads to a far stronger Afrocentric culture in Central and South America, because these enslaved Africans are coming directly from Africa, as opposed to having generational slavery, which we'll talk about in the British colonies, of people born into slavery in the colonies. These are people who are being captured and brought over, so we have a more Afrocentric culture that exists here. In addition, we also see that the percentage of the population of African descent is so much higher in these Portuguese and sugar colonies here. Take a look here. If you compare the Spanish America, which would be the region we spoke about of former Aztec and Inca lands, as compared to Portuguese America, you can see here that up to 50% of the population was of African descent, or were wholly African in their descent. So we can see the massive influx of enslaved labor coming from Africa in these Caribbean and Portuguese regions of Brazil. So this is really going to create a very different social structure that is not quite as fluid as the social structure that existed in Central and South America. What we will see, however, though, and keep this in mind, is this general social, this blended greater spectrum of social existence in Central and South America. Because when we get to talk about British colonies, we're going to see such an enormous difference between what was considered the white population and the black population. So these are some key differences here in the creation and the existence of these colonies. Okay, here are your 3 analysis questions. Thank you, guys.